The promise of America begins in a classroom where every child has a seat, a voice, and a future. This future is empowered by the education that is found in that classroom. This voice was empowered by nearly 2 centuries of progress that we owe to one single movement. In an era in which we're often told, if you listen to the media, that we're in education, we're falling behind, that we're losing ground, what is it that continues to make American education so set aside from the rest of the world? What is it that continues to make it exceptional on the global stage? Is it the fact that we offer education for everyone? Is it that we offer free education? I think it's more than that. I think it's the fact that we offer a truly responsive education, free for all. We pledge for liberty and justice for all, but true liberty can really only be found in education. And in the US, we offer that to nearly 50 million students a year, but the truly remarkable part of that 50 million students is the fact that 15.6 million of them are secondary students. And this is not typical when we look comparatively at the rest of the world. Even in countries that offer, and we know there are really only about 20% of the educational systems in the world that offer free education through the secondary level. And even among those that do offer secondary education as part of their public school system, there are often admissions requirements and fees and other situations that make that education less accessible. And in the United States, we have a distinct commitment to making sure that any barrier that our children face in education, that the system owes it to them to eradicate. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But this commitment, comes with a cost. Ensuring that this opportunity remains free simply for the sake of an educated populace is a commitment that America has said that they're willing to make, and the state and local tax revenues are proof positive of this. Most recent numbers indicate that we spend about $954 billion a year in public education. This comes out to about $16,000 to $18,000 per student, depending on the state and different districts. We truly, this investment is proof of our commitment. We really take this commitment to the next level, because not only do we offer, our free appropriate public education, but again, we're going to ensure that anything that stands between our students and receiving that education as a barrier is going to be eradicated. Our school nutrition program that serves 30 million students a year. I mean, that's essentially 60% of students receiving some type of benefit, to the free public transportation that we offer to get to school, the 7.3 million students that are served by IDEA. I mean, if we see students if you need speech therapy, if you need occupational therapy, if you need counseling, mental health services, whatever we see as a system that our students need to be successful, public education commits to ensuring that those students have. And I think that's truly what makes our system the most exceptional in the world. Unfortunately, this commitment to true liberty and justice in our education has not always been present in our system. Early American education was simply for wealthy white males. It focused heavily upon a religious education. And continuing through the early years of our country, that it continued to be that education was simply, as access to the Bible. In fact, one of the first educational legal initiatives was called the Old Deluder Satan Act. It was 1647 Massachusetts law that indicated that once a town had more than 50 families, that they were required to establish a public school. And the law was named as such because they believed that Satan had the power to delude people when they didn't have access to the scriptures. So it was essentially establishing schools so that they could be literate enough to access the Bible in order to thwart Satan. And so the legal system continued to expand this idea. Several years later, the Northwest Ordinance indicated that this type of schooling needed to continue as we expanded further out west. Unfortunately, this education was still primarily for white males, with no central education focus at all. Post-revolution, Thomas Jefferson proposed some pretty significant reforms for his time. Unfortunately, they seemed to fall on deaf ears because even through the mid-1800s, there was still no significant government funding. There was no curriculum system. There were no standards for educators. Fortunately, the mid-1800s, specifically 1837, would initiate a change that is still present in, or the outcomes are still present in every classroom in America today. Education is the great equalizer of the conditions of men, the balance wheel of the social machinery. This Horace Mann, who was the father of the Common Schools movement, believed that education had power beyond simply accessing the scriptures. He believed that most of our society's ills could be cured with education. So he developed essentially a systemic call for change, and this really is the birth of the reform movement. That we, should move our focus in education from religious goals to benefiting the whole society. And this whole concept of moral and civic education really began with Horace Mann. And Horace Mann moved on to the educational stage by being appointed to the very first Secretary of Education for Massachusetts in 1837. And this gave him a platform to kind of put into place a lot of his ideas in education. He believed in the power of education, and I think that has become a core tenet of our society, that we do look to education to eradicate whatever societal ills is facing our country. So I think when you really look at the history of education, you have to say that this is the true birthday of the modern public school system. His ideas truly gave birth to almost everything that we do in modern practice. And yes, we've evolved dramatically over the course of the last almost 200 years. But if you look at every initiative, and we'll talk about many of these in a bit, but you really, if you look at their DNA, you can trace that back to this movement. Mann's Common School movement had 6 basic tenets. First of all, he believed that there should be a free universal education, that education wasn't simply for the elite. That if we moved the idea of education, and we made it more available to the common man, more available to every man, that we would see changes in our society. And through this, we needed to move from a religious foundation to more of a civic idea of how this could impact our country as a whole. And so he believed that we needed to invest, if this was going to cure our ills as a country, that we needed to be willing to invest. And this was an area that public funds should be utilized for. So this was essentially the beginning of a public commitment to educating our entire population. And, he further believed that if we were going to provide this education, that we need to underline its importance by making attendance compulsory. So he believed that all students should be required to attend. And so we can trace back our current compulsory attendance laws to this idea. He also believed that there needed to be a standardized curriculum, that there were certain goals that education as a whole should be working to meet. So to do that, we would need to look at a curriculum that would work the same in Virginia as it did Massachusetts. So as we began to invest in schools and see the value of education, we began to look at the need to train our teachers. And this training began to result in the development of schools, which were titled normal schools, to ensure that our teachers were capable of giving our students the best education possible. There were several immediate impacts, and we'll talk a bit about the long-term impacts, but there were several that within the next 100 years that you could really see the impact of man's philosophies. First of all, the law began to tackle student attendance. So by the late 19th century, many northern states had attendance laws that required students to attend school at least until they were around 12. Some states superseded that and required compulsory attendance through the age of 14. This had a significant impact on the labor force because it necessitated a reduction in child labor, especially during school sessions. It further underlined the need to consider teaching as a profession. And then these normal schools, as they began to progress, it served to increase the standards and further elevate the profession. As we began to need to standardize this, states began developing a more centralized Department of Education. And this centralized Department of Education led them to adopt set curriculum. And this curriculum initially was pretty much revolved around reading, writing, arithmetic, and morality. This state level government having this central impact really began to create consistency among schools. And then this is the point, as we began to move in this direction as a system, we began to see a decline in religious education. As the public school systems grew, our literacy rate increased. We had a more educated workforce. Our focus as a country began to change because as we moved from a religious focus to a nationalist focus, school curriculums were designed to emphasize patriotism and the need for hard work and the development of work ethic and discipline and the submission to central authorities and overall civic responsibility, all of these concepts that would help people be better, more productive members of society and civilization. I mean, unfortunately, there were still limitations. Even though there was a call for educating all, this all still worked to exclude African American children, Native Americans, and immigrants. Females received, an education light, basically so that they could read their scriptures and count their egg money. There still wasn't a great push toward creating an educated female populace, but that would come. There was still great resistance in the South, primarily prior to the Civil War, but much for the same reasons that that we had a civil war. There was such staunch cultural differences between the North and South that the South at this point was just not really ready to embrace these concepts in the public schools. Fortunately, there is a lasting legacy of these reforms. By the 20th century, secondary school attendance had become an expectation for almost everywhere. I mean, there were still rural outliers, but this expectation was pretty staunchly as part of our society. This expectation grew to include, over the course of the next century, both genders, all races, all learning differences and abilities. That state funding for education has become the expectation. It's become the norm. And as we see some changes at the federal level and some redesign of the Department of Education, or the eradication of the Department of Education, however that ends up shaking out, we see that state funding is going to continue to be more of the expectation. It further continued to raise standards for teachers' employment, and we really see a continued emphasis on a standardized curriculum. And through all of these things, schools have become that great equalizer that man had proposed. And we've done that through an array of services, through nutrition, transportation, access, all of these mechanisms that we put in place to break down the barriers. As we have continued to evolve over like I said, almost 200 years since man's reform movement was initiated, there have been a plethora of initiatives that really owe their existence to the concepts that man introduced into the educational realm. Title I, which is designed to help educate these common students who are not financially wealthy, essentially the students that man wanted to bring into education, because at the time, it was essentially white wealthy students. That compulsory attendance through age 18 is where we are now. It's even tied to the ability to get a driver's license and other things in many areas. His commitment has truly become a reality. Title IX, which encompasses a lot of things, but I think what we know most about it is the gender equity that it demands, specifically in school-sponsored activities. IDEA, the support that this demands for students who have educational barriers. Common Core, this idea that not only do we need to have a standard curriculum, that we need to have a nationally standardized curriculum. No Child Left Behind, which later became ESSA and then has continued to evolve. But the concept remains the same, that we as an education system need to do whatever it takes to make sure that all students, not just the wealthy, not just the privileged, not just male, not just whatever, that they all have equal access to education. And essentially the difference between No Child Left Behind and ESSA was their focus on national involvement and state involvement, which is moving more back toward where man brought us. ESOL, services for speakers of other languages, school nutrition, civics. The concept of teacher certification goes all the way back. It owes its origination to this idea that spawned those normal schools. The Civil Rights Act of '64 and Brown versus Board of Education, of course, it owes itself to a lot of societal development that we've done as well. But its implementation in education, there's a direct relationship to the idea that man espoused, that education should be available for everyone. And as our society has grown to understand that everyone includes all race, genders, creeds, ability. These initiatives have been able to put feet to that idea. So if we take man out of the equation, we take this common schools movement, what does modern school look like? It becomes optional. We return to as a religious base with only a religious intent. Our students become only white, male, capable, affluent. The curriculum standards are no more. Our schools are tuition based, essentially private schools or private tutoring. The instructional quality is again back all over the place. Education would return to marginalizing people just as it did in the beginning. Our populace becomes less educated. Our literacy rates return to nearly nil. Our workforce is not prepared. There's a greater gap between the haves and the have-nots. So all of these things that are part, not just part of our educational society, that are part of our social society, are part of our everyday life, we owe to this movement that originated with Horace Mann. Because education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And that's exactly what Horace Mann did.